Hi Sacha, how are you?
Fine, how are you?
Very good. Thank you very much for doing this.
My great pleasure.
How would you describe the current state of the world?
Fucked up in much the same way that Jacques Fresco, I think, said that a few years ago. It hasn't changed much, but in a beautiful sense. It's a galactic kind of a screw up, I believe, a convolution, a tribulation we find ourselves in. I personally find it extraordinarily inspiring because I believe that at the soul level, both individually and collectively, we've been waiting for this time, the great bifurcation. So I'm thrilled by it and very excited by it. I'm not remotely fearful of it, but it is what it is. It's a convolution. It's a tribulation.
So are we an innately conflicted species? Is conflict part of our growth
Hell no. Hell no. I don't believe that for a moment. I never believed that. I believe quite the contrary. But I do think that there is the intercessionary principle, which I'm banging on about lately, is something which needs to be considered very closely and very mindfully, because we do seem to have a capacity to put up and abnegate our sovereignty, abnegate our higher knowing. And that seems to be, I wouldn't call it a failing, I would say it's a hallmark of our tremendous innocence as a species. But every time we do abnegate that sovereignty or that Christos, that knowing, it creates a vacuum. And that vacuum is then filled by the other. And oftentimes the other is a civilizational miasm. And that can set us back on another journey, rewrite a different, create a different narrative, oftentimes dark and painful, always takes us to a greater sense of knowing, of self. So I sense that there's a beautiful geometry at work and at play nonetheless. But I do say that now is the time for us to stop that business of abnegating our absolute core sovereignty, the I am I'm referring to, of course, and to hold that still point, which is the sheer absence of ego, but the absolute fulmination of selfhood. And that selfhood is what we now need to own, I believe. And in fully owning that and becoming crowned in selfhood, I believe we claim back that old capacity we had to surrender ourselves, offer ourselves up for harvest, so to speak.
So how do you explain ego in a way? In a way, it sounds like ego needs to elevate itself to what as you're suggesting, to selfhood. How do you elevate the ego to selfhood?
You don't, because the one is chalk and the other one is cheese. There is no elevating. One would need to address ego as being connected to time and thus being connected to the lateral plane, so to speak, the time-space phenomenon, both being in a sense the same thing, and self being the transcendent principle which issues into the vertical plane and removes itself, extracts itself absolutely from the time-space linear format and then enters witness. A witness of ego is self, arguably. So I simply suggest that once we stop permissioning ourselves to become either enchanted or intoxicated by so-called reality, we would then enter quite necessarily, and as a function of necessity, enter into the state of witness, which is the transcendent principle that issues from off the lateral plane of ego. I'm not sure that that's going to help us get any closer to the answer that you're asking for. But again, it only goes to underscore that one is chalk and the other cheese in that sense.
So how do you relate to people? I mean, it seems like we're in a more a polarized time to an extreme, and there is definitely a core of humanity that's really focusing on, as you're saying, a sense of self apart from the ego. How do you explain to somebody the separation of ego and self in a practical sense? For yourself, when you're in a moment of internal conflict, do you have moments of internal conflict?
Very rarely nowadays, I have to say. I spent the most of my life in that state of conflict, one way or the other. But when it left me, it truly left, because it was an absolute science, that becoming. To answer your question in as simple terms as I feel I can, um, I would suggest service to self versus service to others is the defining line between ego and self.
So that's kind of the paradox, isn't it, of being a human
Yes.
being? Is that we have to be very selfish at the same time that selfishness has to be transcendent to some degree.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm not sure that we ever need to be selfish. I know why you say that and the logic there, but I'm not sure that that's fundamentally true. I think that the highest rationale and the highest form of logic, what I would term crystal logic for a reason, determines that actually we need to move absolutely beyond service to self and engage fully in service to others in order to truly and fully service self.
So, what do you think is at the core of all this conflict within us? Why is it this conscious species that we are? Why do we have this affliction of what?
I believe we've been interceded. I believe that, again, that capacity that we had to be led or herded or misguided, which issues from within the atom seed of ourselves. Arguably, this is some genetic mutation. That's certainly a storyline I would be happy to engage in. The downgrading of the human gene or the gene pool, and that's an extraterrestrial storyline, or a great many, in point of fact, storylines converge on that issue. But certainly, vanguard science would indicate that the junk DNA is nothing like junk. It is sleeping DNA, sleeping codons, and awaiting a revivification, a re-innovation, as the Great Awakening. And so I don't think that I think that we're in that space right now where we're actually able, for the first time in a long period of time, where we're able to engage consciously and actively, proactively with that rebooting of our DNA, so to speak. So consciousness very much becomes the key factor here. And how much consciousness you or I choose to engage with has always been a matter for you or I individually. This is where so-called freedom choice or free choice comes into it, or free will comes into it. How much do I choose to become drunk on the nectar of consciousness? That is my choice.
Well, that's right, because that was my next. Sorry.
Conversely, do I wish to become enchanted and led by appetite and led by the psychological fusion of drink and alcohol and drugs and sex and all the wonderful stimuli that's available to us, but ultimately is all appetite, functions of appetite.
Do you feel that there is a purpose for our being alive?
Yes, to have this conversation, and for you to ask the very thing you've asked, and for me to endeavor to answer it. Yes, I do. I think the purpose is self-reflecting, self-realizing, self-fulfilling, all at the same time. I fundamentally believe that we are, all of us, extensions of so-called God, Godhead, source consciousness, the vibral mind, the alpha and the omega. And I believe that we're dipping in and out of experience in order to variously participate in the process of manifesting and growing soul. Let's speak in those terms. I believe that this quadrant of the multiverse that we find ourselves in, you and I, is a great and majestic cauldron within which we have elected to dive, not fall. There was no great fall. That is a tremendous myth, and arguably the greatest deception of all. We did not fall. Perhaps we were pushed, but I would suggest we took a backward somersault in full knowingness a very long time ago, in order for us to remember ourselves to ourselves at this time, collectively, and engage with the process of fully realizing and manifesting our prior function, our ultimate function, which is to become the anchor point of absolution. Not just the salvation of self, but the salvation of all intelligence and all species and all elements in this universe.
Wow, you cover a lot of questions in one answer. That's awesome.
Well, it's the majesty of the human condition. Christos, Bodhisattva. We are the Buddha consciousness. We are the Krishna consciousness. We are the Christ consciousness. We are all of those things. But only once we have laid away childish things. And alas, childish things means put away the mandalas, the mantras, the totems, the gospels, the gods, so to speak. Because invariably they are the very last and most dangerous of intercessionaries. Because they're the great totems that we pretend exist outside of ourselves. And ultimately that is an entropic has an entropic consequence for us to believe that God exists outside of ourselves, and we ought to be punished, and we are subject to the whims and the wiles and the fancies of that God. What a ghastly notion.
So how do we create change in the world? I know obviously personally you're creating change within yourself or growth within yourself, but obviously you feel compelled to influence the world in a way. How does real change take place out there? I mean, extending your influence in the world.
I'm not sure that one should speak in those terms respectfully. I think it's dangerous to think in terms of influence. Think in terms of confluence, perhaps. And I don't wish to split hairs, but I think the distinction is vital. The process of one awakening to one's self fully is a process of owning the world. It's a process of taking full responsibility of the all. It is to stop slandering. It is to stop accusing. It is to stop blaming anything outside of self for the hologram which one is faced with. And in that great action of owning the now, owning the all, and taking full responsibility for it, we enter into ultimately bliss, the bliss state, or the 0 point, as I would call it. And in that 0 point, we become coherent with the mind, the vibral mind of the all. And therefrom, it issues to us. And we become an agent of that momentum, that tremendous quanta. And in that space, we can begin to align with the greatest patterns of perfection which exist, and not one of the lower forms or patterns of imperfection, which invariably we have been enchanted into in past times.
Can you talk a bit about the New Earth Project?
Sure. Yes, because it comes to this, and the principle that the New Earth Nation is anchoring is fundamentally a synthesis of consciousness and sovereignty, the one being indistinguishable from the other in real terms. One cannot have consciousness without sovereignty, and one cannot be sovereign without consciousness. And where there is a synthesis of consciousness and sovereignty, that bliss that I referred to emerges as the only function of that synthesis. And that bliss state is the transcendent principle on earth, the anchor point of heaven on earth, so to speak. And this is all that the New Earth Nation is speaking to. It is urging brothers and sisters of the world to awaken to the fact that we contain the Alpha and the Omega. We are that vibral mind of creation. There is no separation between us and Source, between us and the totems that we elect. And in owning that, we can determine the next unfoldment of the reality field of expression. It's pure science and pure art, which is unbearable beauty. So the New Earth Project is where living men and women step out of the invisible contract with corporate fictions. The corporate fiction of you, your identity on a piece of paper, and the corporate fiction of you being a citizen of a government, which is purely a corporate fiction seeking to penalize you wherever it can in order to monetize you. In order that a covert priesthood of bankers or occultic interests and persuasions can harvest human energy, which is why we're sold this false notion of 1260 time. And we're again enchanted into the idea that we should all calibrate our watches and break reality down into discrete units of time, time simply being an accreted value of fear. And so on. And then, of course, we're also co-opted into exchanging those totems of fear, which is currency, which is money, fiat. And so it goes on. So that's a diabolical feedback cycle that we're enchanted into, where we do abnegate or surrender that pure sovereignty and choose rather to step in to those corporate fictions. I am not a goddamn piece of paper. I am not a goddamn name written in all block capitals on that piece of paper. My reality is not ultimately defined and will not be defined by contracts, by fraud, by deceptions perpetrated by me against the world and the world against me. Because I am the one doing the fraud if I am consistently filling out the forms, paying the taxes. I am the one perpetuating that fraud. And until I wake up to that, I must not be blaming the government or the taxman or the anyone outside of self. So it is that integration of pure sovereignty and owning that, taking responsibility for it, that the New Earth Nation speaks to more than anything else. And on the temporal plane, we're engaged in a lot of different activities through the New Earth Institute, and that is promulgating pure law, natural justice through our Law Academy and Law Commission, and the Citizens' Grand Juries, which we are engendering later this year. We're engaged in promoting cancer cures and all the disengaging from the mythos of the agrochemical and petrochemical enterprise out there, which is only seeking to bring about, it would appear, a mass culling of the population. So we're engaging with those very big and bold brushstrokes through the New Earth Institute. We've got tremendous political acumen and academic acumen within the New Earth Nation Institute. But we're also involved in the process of giving out and creating the templates and the blueprints for people, landowners, farmers, people around the world to reclaim their dignity, reclaim their farms, reclaim their homes from the tyranny of municipal and federal so-called authorities that have almost uniformly gone rogue at this time.
If would you say that we project this reality onto the world, or are we thrust into this reality?
We project it, absolutely. I believe that to take it back into the sort of Edenic principle and to keep it quite simple, the serpent is allowed to trick us into offering ourselves up for sacrifice, but the serpent may not sacrifice us himself or itself. And I see how this plays out with the occultic memes, with the Masonic memes, and the satanic and Canaanite ritualistic memes that from the Celts and the Sumerians and going back a great span of time, we have seen how humans have been co-opted from behind the veil and manipulated from behind the veil. One really need look no further in the United Kingdom than the gates of Buckingham Palace, or in Italy to the Vatican City walls, or in Washington to the godless construct that is the Pentagon And let's not even speak about the Oval Office and all the symbology that's been invested into that strange construct in Washington, D.C., and its allegiance to Moloch, the owl. That's all Babylonian and Luciferian worship. Let's be clear about that. That stuff is now a proven science. Forgive me, I've forgotten the question because you triggered me on a subject which I'm quite inflamed about.
Well, what I was suggesting is that if we project our reality onto the world, what aspect of our awareness created this corporate fiction?
Well, we were. I guess it was the bit that refuses to acknowledge the majesty of who and what we are, and that can be the very smallest of shadows in the very biggest of hearts. But so long as that shadow exists, the more one is drawn toward pure truth, that small shadow will become exacerbated and augmented until it becomes only shadow. And that is part of the mathematics of coherence, of phase coherence, of oneself to the greater mind of let's say, the creator. The closer we come to that fulcrum, that point of synthesis between the Godhead and the individual, we are forced, as we move toward that 0 point, to address every single shadow that may exist within. So again, the smallest of shadows in the biggest of hearts ultimately becomes the biggest of shadows once we are drawn close to that Rubicon.
So in your journey to that center point, do you go through moments of despair and doubt?
No, not any longer. I did for a long time, and I had many years of night fevers and cold sweats and all of that, especially when I woke up to much of the Luciferian premise of our civilization. And I got very engaged in the study of the sacrifice of innocence, and then learned how that's actually playing out in the streets of our cities all around the world. Cities being miasms, being cancer tumors of the plane of reality. Be clear about that. There's nothing more toxic to the true condition of the human family than being effectively drawn into cityscapes and then building towers.
Yeah.
They're all Luciferian false light worship, and they all end in tears, as we well know. But no, I don't suffer from despair nowadays, not at all.
So what do you suggest to those people who are in that state right now, that purgatory, where they see that everything is messed up, they feel a sense of loss or of lostness, and they're finding this journey that you seem to be well on your way on. What do you recommend to those people?
Randall, I know the question only too well. One has, so long as one hurts, one has not hurt sufficiently. I don't know how else to put it. So long as one is still hurting, one is still entering the flame. And meaning to say that when one fully engages with the now, in any way, shape, or form, fully engaging with the business of sorrow, absolutely one time, one transcends sorrow. Engaging with jealousy, with one's nature, with anger, fully, absolutely in the now, just a single instance of that perfect owning of the moment is the transcendent principle actuated within that color. That's of the spectrum of the human condition. So we're always given that opportunity. People who complain about their swollen ankles, about never quite being able to, the back is always slightly... People who do that tend to create and manifest that cycle where they're never actually in agony. They're always on the perimeter of it. And we are invited to draw that process out for as long as we choose. But be clear, we're choosing that process.
Awesome. And where do you find moments of joy?
Right now, honestly, right now.
So were you said you did struggle at one time. Were you always kind of aware that you were plopped into an insane world, or was there a moment where something kind of snapped for you?
Well, I was born in sub-Saharan Africa in the middle of a war. So there were bullets flying for the first 12, 13 years of my life. And yeah, if that's not helter-skelter, I don't know what is. So yes, I was aware of how screwed up the planet was as a child, and I was blessed to grow up in that space. So by the time I hit 15, 16, I knew what was repugnant to the human soul, and I knew what indignity looked like, and was able to then set about in my own adventure in life, not taking drugs and not getting into losing self, but actually more into the inquiry. And for a great many years, as a poet and a musician, I was just wanting to penetrate this stuff and look into it and evaluate it and weigh it and balance it, which I did. I did that. I chose to do that through art and through music. And once I felt I'd achieved some synthesis there, I felt I was able to engage in a more mechanical sense with undoing that screwed up matrix. And then I set about activism. And the activism became really, ultimately, the issuance of this New Earth nation. And understanding that even activism is very limiting and very limited. There is a space that is allowed for activists, but activism itself will do nothing to change the narrative. And one is allowed to, rather like at the Bundy Ranch in the U.S., that recent story, it was hilarious to see on the news that they had a what's that part of the U.S. Constitution that allows people to gather peacefully and protest?
Right.
What's it?
Yeah, I can't remember.
What part of it? Oh, but they actually had a little penned off area saying this is the constitutional area where you can stand behind that area and make your protest.
Right.
Of course, no one paid any attention to it. But yeah.
So how do you define yourself today?
Living man.
And how do you experience the world?
As a living man, with very few interceding violations, psychologically and emotionally more than anything else, and intellectually, because I disavow them. They don't exist in my life in that sense. And there is a tremendous freedom there, because one also learns that stress is something which one carries. And we're allowed to carry that burden, and as much of that burden as we choose. I am genuinely the busiest person I know. And I work every single day, 19 hours, 19 to 19 and a half hours. I get very little sleep nowadays. I work incredibly hard, but I'm very, very energized in that space, in the main. I never get sick. I certainly never take any time off, because I don't regard my life, my work, and my play as being anything but the same value. And that there's a tremendous freedom in that. Again, in breaking down psychological barriers and boundaries and putting ourselves into work and play. I think that's a nonsense. And ultimately, I believe that in the reclamation of pure dignity to the human family, we'll see, and that's upon us, we'll see a complete synthesis of people's lives in living, working, and playing. They will become increasingly one and the same thing, as they should be. All living men and women on this plane should be engaging with their bliss, nothing more, nothing less, and we should insist on nothing more and nothing less.
Well, you're awesome to talk to, and you actually answered kind of my last question, which was, well, my last thing I ask is that if you had a public service message, if you could speak to the world and you had 2 minutes to say whatever you wanted to every single individual on the planet, what would you tell people? What would you say to people?
Stop paying taxes for the love of God and love thyself. Really engage with self. And understand that we are paying into the system. Understand that we are the fuel. We are being harvested energetically. Our time, our money, our consciousness, our living blood, the marrow in our bones is being harvested at every turn. Do not pay the penalty charges. Do not participate in that toxic little song and dance routine that is being dreamt up by little grey men and little grey women behind bulletproof glass somewhere, behind the gated villas in Geneva or Long Island or wherever. Just let's disengage from that bullshit paradigm. Let's rise up as a wave of living men and women and make it so.
Awesome.
It's our birth.
Thank you so much. You know, there's one other aspect of this project. I was started out as a musician as well, and there's a song part of the project where we've been asking everybody we interview to sing a line from a particular song. It's called "Oh World," the song, and my lovely assistant here, if you're willing, this is Fabiana.
I'm absolutely going to do it. I'd love to meet your assistant, but you're not going to get me to sing a line because I took an oath to myself. I'm sorry. I took an oath to myself that I would never sing another song until something had clicked in this world, and I'm serious about that.
Okay,
so you're going to have to allow me to step aside on this one.
No
I'm
problem.
honestly on an oath to myself.
Oh wow, that's an impressive oath.
I was a singer for many years, and that's what I did.
Well, that's a shame, but I appreciate your candor, and I understand that your point.
So I've been fired.
Well, what a blessing to meet you anyway. Delightful to meet you.
It's very nice to meet you and to hear you. You're very eloquent. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much, Sacha. Thank you.
Randall, it was delightful meeting with you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.